Well, good morning. I remember back when I was in school, one of the teachers was interacting with us students and asking us questions, and he was interested in or asking about what we found attractive in the opposite gender. Um, and I still remember one of the girls answering the question by saying she liked a guy who wouldn't try to change her, a guy who would accept her as she was. And that was a little bit puzzling to me because I wasn't Mr. Relationship at the time of any kind, not only male female relationships, but just a little behind socially and kind of didn't understand what the big deal was. But I do understand it now. I do understand about people trying to change us, and I'm assuming you understand that too. And perhaps you've had people try to change you and you didn't care for it, would be my guess. And so, why are you trying to do that to Jesus? Did I say that? I thought that'd be safe to say since I'm on video instead of there in person. But I'm afraid I think we do sometimes try to change Jesus and try to make him into something that he isn't. And of course, it's very easy to say people try to make Jesus into something that he isn't. But I think it probably applies to us as well. And we're going to get a little opportunity to check that today. Today, we have two more signs from Jesus. And we're going to begin by reading those two signs from John chapter 6, and then we'll talk about what I just said and some other things as well. So let's begin with the reading. John 6, 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for them to each get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea had become rough because a strong wind was blowing, and when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Let's pray. Lord, please open our hearts, open our minds, open our ears, and help us to hear what we need to hear from this part of your word. I pray in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, 2 more signs here, as I indicated, and next week we'll finish the chapter, and there's quite a bit of dialogue and reaction and impression and division about what the people are seeing and what they're thinking about Jesus. That was too much to cover all at once in one message, so I broke it here. Today, I want to share 3 truths that I think are contained in this text. I think Possibly the more important truths are the ones that we're going to get to next week. They're actually written out in the text. But these three truths are, I mean, they're right here in the text as well. So they're all important. Maybe these are a little more general, and then we'll get down into some nitty gritty over the next 3 weeks or the next week. Okay, so the first truth is we don't get to say who Jesus is. We don't get to say who Jesus is. Now, maybe you noticed in verse 2, I kind of hope you did, because I've been trying to emphasize this, that crowds were following because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Remember John's purpose statement, John 20, verses 30 and 31. Jesus did these signs to show people who he was, and it's working. They're seeing the signs, and they're attracted to him, and they're seeking him out. Then you look down after Jesus feeds these people, and it says in 14, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is coming to the world. So they reach a conclusion about who he is based on the sign that they had seen. And you know, we're so familiar with this miracle, this sign. It's told in all 4 of the Gospels. Don't miss how impressive it is. You know, if we ever have our 5th Sunday potluck and only one person brings food and we all crowd into the room, I've been to some of those where I want to go first in line because there's not much food here. And then when I've gotten a little more mature, I've kind of stepped back and let other people, especially guests, go in line. And sometimes I'll go check with whoever looks like they're in charge and say, do you think we have enough, or should I run get something? And I have made a few runs to get food at potlucks, not here but other places, when it looked like we weren't going to have enough. So I'm aware of this, but can you imagine if only one person brought food, and then some of us go up and say, wow, can we help do anything? And they take off a little bit of the food and they put it on a plate, and we take that plate to one person and they break off a little more, and we take that to another person, and we just keep doing that. They just keep breaking off the food, and a whole big crowd of people is fed. We can't do that, but Jesus can. And it's a sign, and the people correctly observe that the sign tells us something about who Jesus is. Now, again, we'll see more next week as we get into the part that follows. And who they conclude he is this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. And I don't know if you want to turn to Deuteronomy 18 with me or not. I'm going to read you from there. They're referring to something that's stated in Deuteronomy 18. I'll read 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him that you shall listen. So God promised through Moses that he was going to raise up another prophet like Moses, and that the people would need to listen to him. I don't know if you remember, but when the people approached John the Baptist back in John 1 and asked who he was, they asked him, are you the prophet? And he said, no, I'm not the prophet. Now, are the people right about that? Well, I think actually they are. Now, Jesus is other things too, as we've seen. He's the Christ, he's the Son of God, he's the Lord. He has lots of different titles. But if you look at Acts 3, Peter preaches the gospel to the people in the I think it's Solomon's Colonnade in Acts 3. And in that sermon, in verses 22 and 23, he says, Moses said, the Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. You shall listen to him in whatever he tells you. And it shall be that every soul who does not listen to that prophet shall be destroyed from the people. He's preaching that Jesus is the fulfillment of that. So I think back in John 6, the people are right. Yes, Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the prophet. Trouble is, right word, wrong concept. They correctly use the term prophet to describe Jesus. He's the prophet, kind of a definitive prophet. But my goodness, they are mistaken in what they thought that meant. Verse 15, you may be familiar with John 6, verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. And I don't know if you caught this, but he crosses over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, and he's up on a mountain, and then the crowd comes, and then they go down, and he feeds the people, and then they come and try to make him king, and he won't have it. He withdraws up to the mountain. Now, you have to be careful with this because, in fact, Jesus is the king. You've heard me say that a bunch of times, and you've seen it in the scriptures. A couple of weeks ago in Bible class, well, 4 weeks ago now, we saw that Paul was proclaiming Jesus is the Christ at Thessalonica, Acts 17. And the people's understanding was, he's saying there's another king, Jesus. Well, that's true. But again, right word, wrong concept. They wanted a political king, a military king, a national king to make Israel back into the great nation that they had been before. So they're using some of the right terms, but they don't have the right idea, and Jesus won't permit it. He won't permit them to make him into a king. He withdraws up to the mountain. And so that's where I get the point. We don't get to say who Jesus is. Jesus gets to say who Jesus is. And that includes certain terminology, but it also includes filling out the meaning of that terminology. And you may remember from the Gospel of Mark that they saw who he was, but they sure didn't get the servant part of it or the suffering part of it. And so here they see that he's the prophet, they see that he's the king, but they have the wrong concept. So it got me to thinking, what are some of the things that we try to turn Jesus into? What are some of the things that we try to make Jesus into that he won't allow? And let me say before I begin, every one of the ones I'm going to mention has some truth in it. I think they probably wouldn't happen if there was no truth in it. But it's not the whole truth, okay? And so let me mention a couple of these. One of them is a wimp. Some people make him, so meek, and you can see some of those medieval pictures of him that, you just kind of wonder about him. And some people make him all gentle and all mild, and he's playing with a little lamb, and he's always serene and all that, and that's a part of him, but that's not all of him. I don't know if Mike Reyes is here today. He was with us a couple of weeks ago, and we mentioned The Chosen. And he said to me, I don't know if The Chosen portrays him right or not, because Jesus could be really harsh sometimes. Well, Mike, if you're there, brother, I agree with you sometimes, and sometimes I don't. And on this one, I partially agree with that. We need to remember that there were at least two sides to Jesus, and sometimes he could be really stern. He could break out a whip and clean out the temple. You're right about that. But he had his gentle side too. It's just that that's not all there is to him. Can't make him into just the wimp Jesus. Some people make Jesus into my ticket to heaven. And I don't think Church of Christ people are as bad about this, because we seem to struggle with any confidence about going to heaven. But some people, you say the little sinner's prayer, you're saved by his grace, you're in, and you can never be kicked out. And it's just your ticket to heaven. Well, that is a very simplistic understanding of what the message is and what the response is and what the effect is. That's a wrong impression of Jesus. Kind of related to that is, Jesus is my rich parent that pays off all my credit card bills. He's my overdraft protection. I incur more and more debt, but they just keep paying it off. And I incur more and more sin debt, but he just keeps paying. Well, there's some truth in that. He is forgiving and he is gracious, and we are going to always incur some debt, but that's not all of who he is, and he won't let us turn him into just that. Third, and we may be a little worse about this one, my genie, my little genie bottle. You know, when I need something or I want something, I take him out and I ask for it. And he's sort of entitled to me to give me my 3 wishes or whatever it is. Well, again, there's a kernel of truth in that. He does want us to ask and he does answer our prayers. But that's not all he is. It's just our gift giver, our request grantor. My trump card. Some people use them like a trump card. Now I'm going to clarify here, I'm using a lowercase t in Trump, although this could apply to the uppercase T Trump too as well. But what I'm really referring to here with my Trump card is a lot of people use Jesus to legitimize their own agenda. You've probably heard of radicals who say, well, Jesus was a radical. And what they're doing is turning Jesus into what they want him to be because of their own agenda. And it can be all different kinds of agenda, but if you can put the Jesus stamp on it, that seems to give it some approval. So you pull out one episode for his life and quote that to support the thing that you're doing. Well, Jesus upset people sometimes. I'm not sure that Jesus will let us make him into that. It's not about our agenda. We're not the Lord. He's the Lord. He's not going to let us turn him into the trump card to legitimize our own agenda. And then there's my buddy. He's my buddy. You know, we're all buds. We're right there together. Well, he does say, I no longer call you slaves. I call you friends, because slave doesn't know what his master is doing. So friend is a part of it, but slave and servant is also a part of it. Some people have friends who will support them no matter what, even if they're wrong. Okay. You know, and some people think that it is the obligation of their friend to support them no matter what. I'm recording this the day after the Super Bowl, and I don't know if you saw that commercial with Ben Affleck. I think it was a Dunkin' Donuts commercial, and he goes in and he's dancing and doing all these weird stuff to try to impress J-Lo and try to win the contest or whatever. And in the midst of all that, Matt Damon, and I think Matt and Ben are friends in real life, Matt says, sometimes it's really hard being your friend. And it's like Matt wanted to support him in what he was doing, but that was weird and stupid. Well, sometimes we view Jesus as he's my friend and he'll support me. Lord, I know you understand why I need to do this. Or I did this, but I know you understand. You know, we put our words into his mouth. He's not going to put up with that. He's the Lord, not us. And maybe you can think of some others. I challenge you to think about that. That's probably a pretty good exercise to think, what other views of Jesus might I have that are not correct? We don't get to say. He gets to say. A second thing I see in this text will be much shorter, is based on the second episode we read. The key to overcoming fear is to see who Jesus is. Remember that in verse 17, they saw him walking on the water. And by the way, it's another miracle, another amazing, remarkable thing. Don't get dull to how impressive that is. It's another sign. And I think we've had 5 of them in John now that shows who he is. He's the prophet. He's the Christ. He's the King. He's the Lord. And so they see him coming out, walking on the water, and they're terrified. And Jesus says in verse 20, "It is I, do not be afraid." You may have heard, and I think it's correct, I don't really know how to count this, but you may have heard that the most common commandment or exhortation in the whole Bible is do not be afraid, or fear not, or some other similar form to those things. In all kinds of circumstances, God and Jesus and angels and people see others and say, don't be afraid. I love this verse because the solution is right there in the verse. Do not be afraid, it is I. Um, the key to overcoming fear is to see who Jesus is. Now, clearly, it can't be just knowing the right titles to use. You have to see who he is and believe it deeply in your heart. And that's the only thing that's getting me through John when I feel like all the lessons are kind of the same, because over and over again we're seeing these signs of who he is. The thing that's getting me through that is that we need to see it deeper and deeper. That's the key to overcoming fear. And the third thing is that God does test us. Did you notice that? I think it's verse 6, verse 5. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Sure looks like Jesus tests us. And you can find some other examples of that in the scriptures as well. Now, the whole matter of God testing us is a little bit complicated, and I don't have my arms around all of that, and we can't go into all of that today, but I do believe it's true. I do believe he tests us. One thing I do want to say about it is there is one Greek word that is sometimes translated test and sometimes translated tempt. This is confusing, a little hard to get a hold of, but our word test and our word tempt come from the same Greek word. And I think what's going on there is that Satan tempts us because he wants us to fall, and God tests us to see where we are and also to strengthen us. It's kind of like a sports team. Did I mention this is the day after the Super Bowl? When you play in the NFL, you practice and you practice and you practice, and then you play a preseason game. And that's kind of to test and see where you're at and see what you've got. And hopefully it will make you stronger. And I do believe God does that to us. And the reason I mention that word is because I think sometimes when Satan is tempting us, God uses that to test us. Some of the tests that we go through will be when Satan is tempting us. There's a line in the Old Testament. I won't turn to it, and I can't remember the reference right now, but talks about God left Hezekiah to test him and know what was in his heart. A king from or envoys came from Babylon and wanted to see all of Hezekiah's resources and war material, and God left him to test him to know what is in his heart. Sometimes God and Satan are both working at the same time, and even in the same event. Satan's doing it because he wants us to fall. God's doing it to test us and see what's in our heart and make us stronger. And it says real clearly here that he tested Philip. Well, I don't know if it looks to me like Philip may not have passed the test. I don't know. It doesn't go into it much. It just says in verse 7, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. I think maybe he failed because the key to passing the test is to make sure you include Christ. That's how this problem was solved. It was solved by the power of God working through Christ. And we may have to work out the specifics, but I think the solution of whatever test God may give us is Christ. We're recording today 2 days after the celebration banquet for empowering subjects, and if y'all get sick of hearing me say this, please just let me know. But I'm trying to apply it to myself, and the big thing for me right now is what's going to be the future of empowering subjects. I can't see that, and it's a little uncertain right now. And I hadn't thought of it until I was looking at this passage, but it's something of a test. And the key to passing that test, like all other tests, is to make sure that you include Christ. And so I'm trying to concentrate on the progress of the gospel. I'm trying to be content with our support regardless. And I'm trying to consistently give credit and praise to God regardless. I think that's the key to passing the test. So what we have here is really three aspects of the same truth. I told you there were three truths, and we did have a truth about you don't get to decide who Jesus is. I don't get to decide. None of us gets to decide who Jesus is. So that's one of the truths. Another truth is the key to overcoming fear is to see who Jesus is. And another truth is God sometimes tests us, but all of those are about who Jesus is. They're all about seeing and recognizing who Jesus is. So maybe there's three truths here, or maybe there's three aspects to one truth. But I hope that's specific enough that it might be helpful to you in some way in whatever's going on with you right now. And again, next week we'll pursue this further. We'll look at the dialogue and the reactions to this great sign that Jesus did. Today, if we can help you, you can let us know, and we'll pray for you. We'll talk to you, whatever we can to encourage you. Let us know while we sing.